Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. That sounded so good it might be disinformation. And actually, I did learn a few things about Belgian beer while I was over there too. But we can talk about that at another time. This is an important topic, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight to engage with Canadians about changes in our information space and the weaponization of information. There's a lot going on. People are concerned, and in my view, they should be. You know, you've probably heard the adage before that the pen is mightier than the sword. And I'm not so sure that's true anymore. In fact, the question I want to put to you tonight is, what if the pen is a sword? And what does that mean for our society? And what does that mean for our armed forces here in Canada? I think you have to be living under a rock not to have heard about the fact that information is being weaponized by our adversaries. And so tonight I want to get into a little bit about how information is changing in our society, things that are shifting, things that are different than they were even 5-10 years ago. Explore what some of our adversaries are doing in this space to make it clear why we should be concerned. And then I want to finish with what we in the Canadian Armed Forces are doing about it. And it's not our problem solely. This is a societal problem, a problem for all of us. But we have a unique responsibility in the Canadian military, so I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing and then have a great conversation at the end. So I want to start with this. There is a study done by some really smart people called the RAND Corporation, and they looked at what does future conflict look like in 2035. And there is lots of things in this study about biomedically enhanced soldiers and artificial intelligence and swarm technology, really spooky kind of stuff like that. But one of the major conclusions of the study was that future conflict will actually be decided by narrative. Who has the best story to explain what's going on the ground? And this is something that we in the military, it's a bit of a revelation for us because we've always focused on the best planes, the best tanks, the best strategy, the best leaders. That's how you are going to be successful in warfare. But there's another dimension that's becoming increasingly important. We've seen it in past missions like Afghanistan. We see it today in Mali or in Iraq, or certainly in Latvia. And we're going to see it increasingly, according to these very smart people, in the future. The very model of how we communicate has changed. We used to have a sender and a receiver using a medium like the newspaper or television. It was a pretty one-way, linear model of communication. Well, that is over. Today's information environment is a whole lot of people in networks talking to other networks all at the same time. It's chaos. It's a constant flow of information. The other thing that's changing very quickly, when I joined the military, shortly thereafter we had this thing called Gulf War I, the first war in Iraq, Desert Storm, Saddam Hussein, all that good stuff. And CNN deployed for the first time in human history to cover a major conflict live. And they did that with a group of, in each location that they sent people to, there was, 8 to 12 people. There were audio engineers and producers and camera people and on-air personalities, a few $1 million worth of equipment that would fit in a medium-sized cargo van, decades of experience behind that. And now my 11-year-old daughter can do exactly the same thing with her iPhone. That's how much the technology has changed. And that has leveled the barriers to entry into the big game of communicating at a global scale. If you've got one of these, you can communicate around the world at the drop of a hat. All of this is creating vulnerability in our society. How many people here still get the newspaper, a hard copy of the newspaper in the morning? Quite a few, okay? If I was asking this question to across, at the university, to the under 30 crowd, I guarantee you almost nobody would put up their hand, unless they're maybe a journalism student. And even going to websites like torontostar.com or Globe and Mail, these folks aren't going there either. They're getting all their news right in their social media feeds. So as they scroll through those feeds, they see the top news story of the day, they see what their friend did last night, they see a couple of cat videos, and then, oops, there's a piece of potentially fake news or disinformation in there. And the problem is, people don't distinguish anymore between sources of information. It's so fast, they're spending a couple of seconds looking at each thing as they scroll through, and that creates what academics call a vulnerability to falsehood. And that vulnerability, it isn't just teenagers, it isn't just blue-collar workers. Studies show that that vulnerability to falsehood exists among people with the highest levels of education. There are studies that show that false information, false news on the internet spreads 7 times faster than the truth. Why? Because it's more interesting, more sensational, more outrageous, and that drives attention and causes people to share it. Who's heard of an echo chamber here? Okay, about 30%. So I'll just quickly explain. It's another phenomenon that social media networks create where you decide who you follow and what information you get. So you follow the people that you respect, the people that you admire, the people that have the same views as you, your friends, and the result of that is you're never exposed to a worldview that's much different than the ideas that you already hold. So, and when you do come into contact with a different ideology, a different religion, a different way of life, you tend to want to block it and get it out of your feed and just stay where it's safe amongst your own sort of friendly points of view. And this is particularly unhelpful. You know, 20 years ago, we would open our hard copy of our newspaper, and on the weekend there would be some kind of editorial page, and on one side an expert would be for the issue of the week, and on the other side of the page there would be someone who was against it. And you would read both sides, consider the opinions, and you'd have dinner with the family, and you would debate these things and discuss them. Today, people can't talk about anything around the dinner table, right? It's too divisive. Look south of the border. Try to go to a family dinner somewhere in the US and bring up politics and see what happens. It's sad. It really is sad, and it's going to create problems for us. At the same time, what were traditionally trusted sources of information are now trusted less. And this is a study from the US, but I can tell you that the numbers are a bit better in Canada, but the trends are the same. And the trends are the same everywhere across the Western world. People are putting less trust in elected officials, less trust in journalists, less trust in authority figures. And so where is reliable information going to come from? How will we know what the truth is? And I'm going to play a video, and I'll just give a cue to the great folks that are running the AV here that we're going to go to this video in just a second. In fact, you can bring it up and just hit play when I say. And this video is the former President of the United States, Barack Obama, explaining just how dire and scary the situation is becoming. And Barack Obama is known to use strong language, right? So I just apologize in advance for the strong language he's going to use. So if we can roll that video, it'd be great.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. That's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you. And stay woke, bitches.
So again, I apologize for the language, but the point that that video makes is too strong. And this technology, you actually no longer need an impersonator to make it work. What you need now is about a minute or less of audio from the person you want to impersonate, plus some video footage, and computers can render completely very realistic looking impersonations of our world leaders and the most influential and important people on the planet. And this technology is available for free download on the internet right now. And it's only getting better. So very, very quickly, in the very immediate future, you could be watching a video of somebody you respect, admire, follow, and it could be completely false, and you won't even know it. That's where we're at, folks. This gentleman who's up on the screen here now, he is the head of the Russian armed forces, General Gerasimov. And he said something a few years ago in articulating his doctrine and strategy for moving Russia forward, and that was this, that he believes that weapons, they're not nearly as effective as other tools at his disposal. Tools like information, tools like economic pressure and cultural pressure and religious pressure. All these things we saw unfold in Crimea when the little green men snuck across the border. But the little green men, there were just a few of them, and they really didn't fire too many shots at all. It all happened through influence, through information, through hybrid tactics that were hidden. And the Western world didn't know how to respond. They were paralyzed. They hadn't seen anything like this in the recent past. This is what our adversaries are thinking about. And they are investing in this big time. Anybody know what the top news channel on YouTube is in the world? The top performing news channel? Any guesses? Yeah, go ahead. RT. Absolutely, RT, by far. And in 5 US cities, RT is the #1 foreign news channel that's watched in those cities, ahead of BBC, which scary. They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on RT, on Sputnik. And then if you go into Eastern Europe, where there are Russian speakers outside of Russia, there are all kinds of outlets that make RT and Sputnik look very tame in terms of their level of fake information. We got attacked ourselves in the Canadian Armed Forces within days of showing up in Latvia as part of the NATO mission to deter Russian aggression and to assure the population of that part of the world that NATO would stand behind them. So this is a headline from literally, I think, 3 days after we got on the ground. It was in the Russian-speaking media in Latvia, and it said, hey, there's a gay battle group here. And they used these pictures from a dark chapter in our history from, 8 years ago. This guy is now serving life in prison for crimes. But they used those pictures as if this happened today and as if this guy was in Latvia and this thing was going on. And why did they do this? Well, unfortunately, in that part of the world, they're not as tolerant as we are. And homosexuality is viewed very negatively among the Russian diaspora and in parts of Eastern Europe. And so they wanted to create this theme that NATO was coming to their part of the world and they were polluting that part of the world with values, lack of values, this sort of idea of erosion and invasion. And that matches up very well with another part of their narrative, which is it's not Russia that's the aggressor, it's NATO that's the aggressor. So very difficult challenges. Fortunately for us, this didn't really work. And it didn't work because 6 months before we went to Latvia, we knew this was coming, something like this, and it still happens every other week we get something like this. But myself and a few other people, we met with Canadian journalists and said, we're going to get hit. with disinformation, with fake news, you will be targeted. Don't just, create a news story or retweet the story. Call us. Verify the information first. And you know what? You can do something else for us. Talk about this with your audiences, with Canadians. Sensitize people to the fact that this is going on all the time and it will be leveraged against us. And of course, we work closely with our allies, our host nation in Latvia, and really were able to diffuse this and get it called out for what it was within an hour of it showing up, including in Russian-speaking media in Latvia. That's kind of what we need to be doing. Here's some of the other tools that are being employed on a regular basis. There are conspiracy theories being used. Certain aspects of an issue get cherry-picked and blown out of proportion. Personal attack is used to make people ignore the issues altogether. Doubt is a big tool, particularly in the West. States like Russia, China, also non-state actors like extremist groups, they don't necessarily want to convince you that their ideas are right. Sometimes they just want to confuse you to the point where you're not sure who's right. And that just allows authoritarian regimes to be able to act with impunity. So, does anyone remember flight MH17? It was a Malaysian airliner that was shot down over eastern Ukraine about 3 years ago by a missile. And Russia went into overdrive. The Kremlin floated conspiracy theories day after day about who might have shot down this jet. And the theories were wide-ranging, but basically anybody but Russia. Couldn't have been Russia. Had to have been somebody else. Aliens, NATO, the Ukrainians, who knows? But of course, now, after months of investigation, we have conclusive proof. But at the time, they were very effective at creating a lot of doubt about who was actually responsible, which again delayed response, made it much more difficult to figure out what an appropriate reaction to that incident should be when there was so much confusion. There are good ways to deal with this, and I don't need you to read this because it's too small, but it's basically from a behavioral psychology textbook. And what experts in this field tell us, they tell us a lot of things, but to simplify a few points. One is resiliency among society is important. So getting people to be aware that this type of disinformation exists, that these things are going on, and to encourage them to practice good information habits. So when you see something outrageous on social media, don't go, oh, that's neat, like, follow, retweet, whatever. Question it, look it up. Did it really happen? Is this really true? And if it did not happen, if it's fake, call it out. Say something. Another thing the experts tell us is we have to focus on our own story, our own narrative, and not worry so much about constantly responding to an adversarial narrative. And I think that's just as true in politics as it is in sort of information warfare between states. So if you look at what's happening south of the border, oftentimes one politician is doing outrageous things over and over, and nobody has time to catch up to what the truth might be, or they're too busy trying to rebut the last thing that was said to worry about, we forget about the real issues. We forget about the things that are really important. So we have to, as a society, make sure we understand what our values are, what's important to us, and communicate about those things, not about what our adversaries might want us to focus on. Anyone heard of Jenna Abrams? She started on Twitter about a year before the American election. She started tweeting about fashion and politics, and very quickly migrated over to divisive issues in U.S. society, and some of the rioting and things that happened. And it turns out, she caused some pretty polarizing rifts to occur amongst her followers. Turns out she was fake. No such person as Jenna Abrams. It was somebody from the Kremlin who created this persona and amassed 70,000 followers on Twitter. She was interviewed by all of the most prominent media outlets in the world, including the New York Times, Washington Post, the big papers from Europe. All interviewed her, got her opinion, printed it, millions of copies around the world. Incredible amount of influence. To give you an idea, our Chief of Defense Staff, General Vance, has, I think, 8,000 followers on Twitter. She had 70,000. The really spooky thing is, so Twitter found her, she's been deactivated, you can't find Jenna Abrams anymore, but we don't know how many more Jenna Abrams might be out there. Pretty difficult to figure out who's real, who's not real. Russia's not the only player in this space. China's an emerging player, and most of their efforts are focused on issues around the South China Sea, but it's a space to watch, that's for sure. They have a doctrine of three warfares this is in their military doctrine, to leverage public opinion warfare and psychological warfare and legal warfare. So they're thinking about this. And of course, extremist groups are very effective at recruiting online, at mobilizing, spreading hatred. We saw in Iraq, they did an armed drone strike. They got a commercial drone. They figured out how to put a grenade on it and were able to drop the grenade on an Iraqi military camp. It didn't hurt anybody. It did only minor superficial damage, but that wasn't the point. The point was they live streamed the attack to their followers around the globe, and it was seen as a great step forward for their capability. They understand how to use this technology. And this is sort of the situation we're in. You know, the great philosopher Stephen Colbert sums it up pretty well. He says, you know, it used to be that you could have your own view, but you couldn't have your own facts. But that's not true anymore. Perception has become everything. And he actually coined this term called truthiness, which is the phenomena where people don't believe what's true based on fact. What they want to be true is now what they believe, and that's what he calls truthiness. And the way I like to just sort of sum up this whole situation that we're in, so I'm a military communicator, and we have to go to dangerous places and communicate about really complex issues to people that are from different cultures, speak different languages. I mean, it's about as complex a problem as it gets in the communication space. But let's simplify this right to the base, most simple concept we could think of. And that is, okay, shapes. We've got 3 shapes up on the screen. So imagine if there were 3 world experts, and each expert went into a room to look at the shape that was in the room. So the Russian expert goes in, comes out after a few minutes and says, we've leveraged all of the Russian scientific capability, and I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, this is a square. It's a square. You need to believe that. And the Chinese expert goes into the room, comes out after a while and says, we've leveraged all of our ancient wisdom and the 1 billion people that we have in our country collectively, we've networked them, and we've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's a circle that's in the room. Absolutely, it's a circle. And then the Canadian expert goes in, comes out 30 seconds later and says, wait a minute, folks. Russia and China are lying to you. It's fake news. It's actually a triangle that's in the room. So the question becomes, who do you believe? Who's right? Anybody? Yeah. The Canadian. We hope. Yeah. That's right. The shocking truth is they're all right and they're all wrong all at the same time. Because the object that's in the room is this thing in the middle here that's like a wedge-shaped thing with a circle on the end. And if you're perceiving that, if you've got a flashlight and you're shining it from the top down, if that's your perspective, you're going to see that triangle shape, and vice versa for the other ones. And the so what of this weird analogy is, in order to fully understand an issue, I mean, we have to be able to get around to all sides. We have to understand there's a reason why other audiences are perceiving things differently, why they think differently, because they've got a different set of cultural values, a different set of experiences, sort of shared stories in their society. And if we're going to be effective at talking to people who think that this is a square, well, we better understand why they think it's a square. And we better get over into their perspective and figure that out. And if we want to figure out, ultimately we would get all of those people to do the same thing. But in that sort of chaotic information environment, our chances of being able to do that are small. But at least we've got to understand the perspective of other folks. So I worked for NATO for quite a while, and one thing I can tell you is, in the area of military technology and power, our adversaries won't be able to compete with us probably until at least 2050. Most experts put, China is definitely on the rise, Russia's making a resurgence, but most experts feel that it'll be at least 2050 before parity in terms of military capability occurs. We're that much further ahead. We spend more, we do more research, we've got more expertise, better trained people. It's called Overmatch. We call it Overmatch, and we always want to have this, because if the existence of your nation is at stake, you want to have Overmatch. The problem is our adversaries understand this, and they've moved out of this space. Russia won't try to challenge NATO in a direct conflict. It's very unlikely to happen, fortunately. But what they're doing is trying to operate in a pre-conflict phase in the information environment, or in the cultural environment, or in the political environment. Why? Because they have the overmatch in that realm. The Kremlin can make up any kind of information, conspiracy theory, or lie that they want to, and nobody will challenge them. Who's going to hold the Kremlin to account? Whereas a democracy, you better believe if one of our elected leaders or one of our generals got up and started lying to the Canadian population, what would happen? It wouldn't be good. So they've got the advantage in that space, and they've also got the advantage in the strategic space, in that authoritarian regimes tend to have a 10, 20-year lifespan. They're thinking decades in advance. Our elected leaders are thinking up until next October, and that's it. It ends there, right? This is a real disadvantage, and this is being leveraged against us today. So that brings up an important question. Is this a weakness? And how do we respond? And I think it's pretty clear, I hope, to everybody here that this speaks to the very fundamental reason for our societies. The reason that people who wore this uniform went and fought and died 50 or more years ago in Europe was to protect the freedoms that we have to express our ideas, to debate, to hold our political leaders to account. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And in fact, this idea that the trust in the media is eroding, we need to do something about that soon, because you say what you want about the media, at least they have some professional standards, at least they have training, at least there are ways to hold them to account. Other sources of information on social media, there's no way to hold them to account. So we need to, as a society, think about institutions that we've had for a long time that are in decline, and find ways to prop them up and to realize that they're important. What really keeps me up at night is this. We're seeing things in Europe in particular, where actors like the Kremlin are setting up fake non-governmental organizations. So it'll be a charity that's supposedly there to protect the environment, or a think tank about political issues or social issues. These are really good things, right? Or journalists that are working for a journalistic organization. The problem is they're hiding behind the guise of holding democracies to account, but they're controlled by a foreign power, and their real aim is to destroy the society that they're operating in. They want to create division amongst allies. They want to create divisions in society. They want to exploit political rifts, societal rifts, and tensions to try to erode the fabric of our societies. And in Canada, we've gotten off fairly light so far for a number of different reasons, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that this couldn't happen here. It's happening next door. It's happening to all our allies in Europe. And we need to have conversations about this before it happens. And as a military officer, I feel particularly vulnerable here because, sometimes we have better ways of getting information than the average citizen. So we may know that a journalist is not really a journalist, but in fact they're a proxy for another nation. And what do we do if we know that? If we speak up and say this person should be removed, they're not a real journalist, we could be accused of undermining democracy, and this is accountability, and how dare you suggest that something untoward is going on. So it's almost like to do something about it sets society off against itself. So what I hope is that our nation will increasingly recognize that this is a problem for our entire society, and that we'll start to get folks together from all political stripes, from the media, from think tanks, academics, members of all parts of society, and we'll talk about this stuff. And we'll figure out before the crisis hits how we're going to react when it happens, because it will happen. So what are we doing about this in the military? Well, a bunch of things, and one of the things we're trying to do is think outside the box. And the idea of focusing on whose narrative might win the next conflict, I think it's pretty outside the box for a military force. And it's going to mean taking risks. And the strategist called Mikkel Rasmussen wrote a great book about the risk society and how societies need to think about risks and uncertainty. And one of the conclusions he comes to is, if there's a whole bunch of nations that are unwilling to take any risk, and there's one that doesn't care and will take all kinds of risk, that nation will run roughshod over everyone else. Everyone else will be paralyzed, and they will exploit the situation. And it kind of makes me think about the current situation with the regime in the Kremlin. They take a lot of risks. They moved into Georgia. They've put troops in Moldova. They've taken over Ukraine. They've sent troops into eastern Ukraine. I mean, we thought that all of this was over after World War II, and that we set up a rules-based order for the world. Well, guess what? They're challenging it. That's a problem. We need to use a sense of humor, I think, to deal with this. This is a tweet that was put out when Russia was sending things into eastern Ukraine, and it was done by the NATO mission, the Canadian mission to NATO in Brussels. And it was actually so Russia was claiming at one time that these soldiers that got caught by the Ukrainians, that they weren't really there fighting, they were just lost. So this 20-year-old intern came up with this idea, well, let's give them a map to show them so they won't get lost. And I'm sure that the supervisors weren't there that day, because this got approved in like an hour and it went up online. And it became the most shared social media thing the government of Canada ever did. And the Russians reacted very strongly to this. It works. Humor works. So we need to take risks. We need to be funny. And we need to think a little bit long term, too. So when these heavy weapons were crossing from Russia into eastern Ukraine, I was working at NATO. We were trying to convince populations that this was going on. We had all the satellite data from classified military satellites, but we couldn't share it. It's the hardest thing in the world to declassify US military satellite pictures. It'll never happen. But fortunately, we were able to get a civilian satellite that was on contract with a State Department. We beamed that satellite over in a certain direction, and we got not as good images, but good enough. And we set up a press conference, and we told a story. And the story showed heavy weapons from traditional bases in Russia moving towards the border, setting up in these bases that had been abandoned for 20 years. Then suddenly, 2 days later, they were gone. And what happened just a few kilometers across the border in Ukraine? There are these heavy weapons, these artillery systems, very complex military systems, operating at a high level of professionalism, following exact Russian doctrine. And things that take, I know as a military guy, it takes 5 years to train people to be able to do that kind of thing. But according to the Kremlin, no, these were factory workers from eastern Ukraine that figured out, they found some equipment and they figured out how to do it. But we got these images, did the press conference. Within 12 hours, they were in 8,000 outlets around the world. And 2 weeks after that, the European Union voted to increase sanctions against Russia, something that they've been holding out for months. And I think I'll skip this video because I'm all out of time, but it comes down to this, and this is a great book if you're interested in strategy. Future conflict is going to be really centered on imposing meaning on people, describing what is happening in terms of conflict to groups of people, to societies, to the world, and they will judge who's on the right side and who's on the wrong side. And this is not going to be easy. These will be battles of narrative. And we saw this in Afghanistan. I think we had a very good narrative in Afghanistan for the Afghan people. We said, we're here, we're unbiased, we want to help your government and your society to progress out of violence, to get some standard of living and some stability back so that your children can have a better life than you have. And that resonated with the people of Afghanistan. It would have worked in a vacuum. The problem was the Taliban were also in the fight, and they had a narrative. And their narrative was, those people, they're leaving someday. And if you help them, when they're gone, we're going to kill you and we're going to kill your family. That was the narrative battle that was at stake. And that really is at the root of why we weren't more successful in Afghanistan. So it's a cognitive battle. It's a battle of the mind. And some people might think, oh, there's a military guy talking about cognitive battles. This kind of scares me a little bit. I hope it doesn't when I'm done talking to you, because we are not going to be doing the same thing as our adversaries do. We're bound by policy, by rules, by ethics, that we don't do things like brainwashing. And as a guy who's been a communicator for 20 years, I can tell you, it might work in a cult, or it might work in a really isolated setting where you could control somebody. But governments to societies, it doesn't work. I mean, governments are notoriously clumsy communicators, and societies are composed of very smart people that figure things out pretty quickly. So what we've learned, because we used to go into conflicts, remember you've heard about Vietnam or you've seen movies, and the whole idea of winning hearts and minds? You can't do that. It's kind of like going to Montreal and trying to convince all the Habs fans that they should change to Leafs fans. Like, how hard is that going to be? I can't even convince my kids to believe, that the TV show that I like is better than the one that they like, or that music from my generation is better than music from their generation. I know my kids better than anybody. I speak their language, same culture, common values, common everything. I can't get them to change their minds. But what we can do and what we need to do in the future is worry about how do we change people's behavior. And actually, societies and governments have been doing this for a long time. They tell you don't speed, and you probably still believe that you're capable of speeding and that you would like to speed. And you see this, and it's yellow and danger, and maybe it causes you to think a little bit. So we can up the ante a little bit and go emotional on you. And maybe that's that's a really cute kid. I don't want to kill his mom or dad, so maybe I will slow down. And if that doesn't work, well, then we'll have a cardboard cutout of this guy on the side of the road, and chances are that's going to work, especially if once a week there's a real guy there, right? So, we've tried to change people to get them to stop smoking, these kind of things. I think it's okay. And in the military, we've got a bunch of folks that do this, and they're thinking about this a lot. They're from the intelligence community, from the influence activities group in the Army, and some others, countering violent extremism. They want to change people's behavior. They don't want them to join extremist groups. They want them to do something productive in society. Pretty good stuff, right? The thing that all these guys have and gals have in common is that they're focused on people overseas. They don't get to operate in Canada. That's people like me. And here's some of the stuff that they do. We will use deception towards one group of people, and that's our adversaries. And militaries have been deceiving the enemy since the dawn of time, right? Sun Tzu talked about all warfare is deception. And this is actually an inflatable tank. It was, it's historical, but they had a bunch of these inflatable tanks. They would set them up to fool the enemy into where they were actually located. Does anyone think it's a bad, immoral thing for us to fool the enemy? Probably not, right? Normal. What about the people in the countries where we operate in? Well, we learned something in missions like Afghanistan, and that is when you're doing what's called counterinsurgency, the most important thing, if you want to be successful, if you want to win a counterinsurgency operation, is these folks have to trust you. And if you're manipulating them, they're not going to trust you. So we're not even going to get into that business overseas in other countries because it doesn't make strategic sense, for starters. It gets more complicated because the world is all interconnected. And what if a Canadian journalist finds out about our deception plan, our inflatable tank, or whatever we're using? Probably not an inflatable tank anymore, but we might, in a battle zone, we might float some information out there that will cause the enemy to think we're doing something and we're really doing something else. And if one of our people gets a hold of it, then we've got a bit of a dilemma. But not really, because I've worked with Canadian journalists in conflict all the time, and we actually trust them. And we'll take them aside and say, hey, this is part of our plan. Don't report on it, because Canadians will die if you do. And they respect that for the most part. And if we don't trust them, then we just say we can't talk about it as a future operation. But we will never deceive Canadians, even while we're trying to deceive our adversaries. And it all comes down to, when you're trying to change behavior, when you're trying to advocate for something, like I might want to advocate to you folks that it would be a great idea to have your kids consider a career in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I don't think you would think I was a bad person for advocating that, right? As long as it meets a test. So for me, it's got to be truthful. It has to be transparent, meaning you have to know who I represent. I don't come on here pretending to be from a fake NGO. I'm wearing my uniform. My social media account is clearly identified. We don't hide behind proxies. And lastly, it has to be helpful. It can't be harmful. So that's what we're doing. We're taking some of our people and retraining them. So people that used to just be photographers, we're making them social media operators and equipping them to tell stories so that we can fight that next conflict. And we're standing up a group, and we're bringing in a bunch of capabilities, and it's primarily aimed at the strategic level. All those other folks I talked about before, they're really focused on what's happening on the ground in a theater of operations. The folks that work for me are really thinking about the big picture, because our adversaries think about this as strategic. They're calling the shots at the Kremlin, at the top levels of their government, and what they hope to do to us is strategic. So we've got to be thinking as well. So we're coming up with this new ideas, new capability. How do we understand what's going on social media and what's going on, what people are thinking about? And how do we create campaigns that really focus in on our message, that really help to shape people's behavior? So if it's overseas and we want people to report illegal activity, we'll do that kind of a campaign. And if it's at home and we want people to practice good information hygiene and not pass on fake news, we might try to convince Canadians of that. But again, it's truthful, it's transparent, and it's helpful. So we've got to get better at understanding the information environment. It's moving so fast, it's so huge, there's millions of conversations going on at once. We're working on ways where we can, the stuff that's open source, we can digest it and understand it. If it's going on in a private chat room, folks like me aren't looking at it. The RCMP might look at it if they've got a warrant, we're not. And we're tracking media coverage, trends, that kind of things. But there's a bunch of things that we're not going to do, and I'm going to end with this. We're not going to use these tools and these abilities to try to impact policy or procurement, because that is not our space. That's the government. Elected officials get to decide policy, and that includes major equipment purchases. And we will lose our credibility in a heartbeat if somebody figures out that we're trying to convince Canadians that this kind of ship is the best, and don't, make sure you pressure the politicians to get us this one and not that one. We'll never operate in that space, and if we do, there will be trouble. And there's a pretty well-known court case going on soon. Admiral Norman, you might have heard about that, and a ship. Well, the reason it's a big deal, and I don't know who's right or wrong in this case, and the court will decide, but the reason it's getting the attention it's getting, it's because we're not allowed to be in this space. We're also not going to track individual Canadians or even our allies. We don't do that. We don't set up files on people. Again, other parts of the government might. They've got a mandate to do it, and they have legal oversight when they do it. We're not going to even track individual journalists or harass them or try to convince them to cover us in a certain way. We'll track media outlets and media coverage, but not individual journalists. We'll never do things that are unattributed in my community. Again, in theater, some of my cousins working in intelligence stuff might do this sometimes, but they'll never do it in Canada. We're not going to manipulate imagery either. I don't really look like that. I get up and work out, but it's not quite to that level yet. Our adversaries are doing this all the time. There's fake video, fake repurposed imagery. If you're interested in learning more about that, go to a website called Stop Fake. It's a grassroots organization that exposes this stuff. And we're not going to manipulate people's minds. That said, context matters, so if there's sensational news coverage about us, or someone's going on social media and trashing our reputation, we're going to stand up for ourselves, but I think all of us understand that. So it comes back to ethics. And with that, I want to conclude by saying things are changing. It's an important issue. I hope that you spend some time thinking about it, because in my opinion, the pen really is a sword. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. That was I think that to say that was an insightful set of remarks would be an understatement. And it's really telling, and I think you've seized on a couple of things. And before we dive right in, I'm going to invite the audience to come up. And it was too bad that we had to skip over that video, because I saw on the bottom that it was Jon Stewart. Does everyone know who Jon Stewart is? He's one of my favorite comedians, and I lived in New York for a period of time, and I actually went and saw a live taping of the Jon Stewart show. And before the segment, he actually came out and talked with the audience, and actually that's what this time of the night is. It's time to talk with the audience. So there's a microphone on both the left and right sides of the auditorium. If you'd like to ask a question, I'd invite you to the microphone. Please just introduce yourself, and then we'll take your question. Now before or while we're waiting, let me fire one off to maybe warm things up here. When I was listening to your talk, I thought of one word: propaganda. And propaganda is as old as old as time. It's as old as war fighting itself. People have been abusing information since there was information to abuse. So what, in your view, is different now?
Well, first of all, you're right, propaganda has been around for a long time, and the original meaning of the word was a positive one. It was a Catholic term to contend for one's faith and to convince someone of a higher ideal. And of course, that's changed over time to a very negative term. But you're right, people have been using deception, deceit, lies, covering their tracks for a very long time. I think what's changed is the ability to disseminate such information on a massive scale and to use technology. Today we saw with that Obama video what you can do with technology. During World War II, they couldn't impersonate Prime Minister Churchill the way that we could impersonate a world leader today. And this mix of the technology, the way that information spreads, the speed that it happens, and the fact that people are so busy and not really, they're not discerning consumers of information, just makes us so vulnerable to this phenomenon.
We have a question over here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is James, and I just wanted to ask, you're talking about the idea that the media outlets are more reputable than like social media or more independent news like websites or whatever it might be. I just wanted to ask, how can we be so sure that some of our more so-called reputable media outlets aren't being used as proxies by either the Russians or the Chinese or whoever it might be, or individual journalists who for that matter, who work for these more mainstream media outlets, and how can we be sure that the information that we're getting from our media is as objective as possible? Thank you.
Thanks.
That's a very good question. I think you're right to be concerned, because I know for a fact that in parts of Europe, this exact thing is going on. There are journalists who are pretending to be journalists who are not journalists. It's a difficult space. I work with media all the time, and most of them are quite professional and are really doing the best that they can. Their business model is under pressure, and let's face it, I think as a society we have some blame to accept here, because the reason the media is becoming a little bit more sensational is because that's what we collectively want. That's what we're seeking out. So if we're going to be part of the solution, I think we've got to be a little bit more discerning, again, consumers of information. But the reason I made the point about media is because, not to say that they're perfect, because they're not, but at least there are codes of conduct. At least people have to go to journalism school typically to get a job, and they get taught about standards and ethics, and there's things like the Broadcast Standards Council and the Canadian Press Council that I wish their ability to hold people to account was stronger, but at least it exists. At least you can make a complaint. But a blogger or a social media poster or someone who's set up in their basement or a foreign agent, there's no recourse against that. And the last thing I want to add is I've had some interesting discussions with various Canadian security agencies, and they are tracking this problem. And some of them have shared with me it's a dicey space for them, because we live in a country where we don't want to investigate journalists, because that happens in authoritarian regimes. But I think we have to accept the fact that our adversary could do this, and when they do it, we have to figure out the appropriate way in a democracy to deal with that kind of problem, and it's tough.
And I think there's an adjunct but related point that's probably worth mentioning. The business model's under pressure, but there's also another dynamic that's taking place against traditional media as well, and that's certain political leaders are actually attacking media outlets, and so that creates a very confusing discourse in the public space, because when real journalists are called fake, how do we know what to believe? And that's, I mean, I wouldn't put you on the spot to answer a question on that, but it's just another dynamic that's at place. So there's pressure on the business model, but there's also a very, very toxic thing happening in politics right now. Please.
My name is Matthew, and I actually work for CTV.
All right.
So that was actually a great question beforehand to kind of lead into mine. Media companies, they're still a business. And so we compete against these bloggers, these other social media, and like you said, they sometimes send out things that are sensationalized. And as we've noticed, people tend to like those more and more. Media kind of has been dabbling more and more into that because, once again, they are a business. Is there something that you can see where, media organizations can ignore, I guess, the bottom line a little bit more and get more to like hard-hitting news that maybe might not be as sexy to some people, but still get the information out there so that they can all get it and read it, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I come from Alberta, and by nature, I am not really in favor of government involvement. But in this case, I'm coming around because I think we have to start thinking about the institution of the media, the fourth estate in this country, as so important to our future and to the fabric of our society, that it may be something that we have to think about funding using tax dollars in an increasing way to make sure that this trend doesn't continue. Because the trend line that we're on right now, it's pretty scary, and you look at what's going on south of the border, as you pointed out, and it seems to me that the only people that are standing up to defend the media are the media themselves, and it kind of rings hollow when an industry is defending itself. I think we need more think tanks, citizens, individuals to stand up and say, hey, we need the media, they're important, and we ought to do something to make sure that they retain professional standards, are held to account, and can make a living without having to sell out to some of the things that we see going on today. So yeah, I take your point, absolutely.
Well, and sorry, I just wanted to mention, fascinating topic, love it, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So it's a good question, and it strikes me like there are other opportunities to think a little bit differently about the role of media in the country. And one of the things that comes to my mind is the philanthropic or tax status of media companies. So in Canada, it's impossible to get charitable status as a media company, but maybe that's something we should think about. And I know that it was articulated in the federal budget, and maybe thinking through the public interest role that media plays. So maybe if I want to switch gears a little bit here, because I know that we got a number of questions on the role of media in society and the role of media as it relates to the spread of false information. But I'm also acutely aware of the fact that I'm sitting here beside a soldier. And this is an odd conversation to have, because when you think of the military, you think of war fighting. And so I note also that I've read the Canadian Defence Policy, Strong, Secure, and Engaged, and it talks about hybrid war and the gray zone. So how difficult is it for you as somebody in your position to be talking about Twitter when you're used to talking about tanks? And I just made that up. I didn't actually write that down. That was pretty good.
Especially since I used to be a tank commander.
Nice.
So I switched from being a tank commander to doing communications in 1999. And I did so hesitantly because I really did enjoy bombing around on tanks and making things explode and that kind of stuff that that young people like to do. But I have to say it's been a fascinating ride along the way, and doing what I do now, I never would have been in the same rooms with defense ministers and generals and in the North Atlantic Council and watching strategy and policy get made and watching people wrestle with these key questions that are going to determine the future course of our planet. And in order to be able to operate in that environment, you have to be able to operate in the gray zone. And I think soldiers are quite comfortable doing that because, you know, warfighting, it's the ultimate competition. You know, if you're second place, that means you're dead, or your nation doesn't exist anymore, potentially. And so we have ways of operating one thing we call maneuver warfare, where your commanding officer he doesn't tell you everything that you need to do from A to Z. He said, ultimately, your aim is to accomplish something like this. And how you get there is completely up to you. And it has to be that way because battle is so unpredictable. So many unforeseen things happen. If you're following a linear path, it'll be disrupted and you'll fail. So you have to have these people with an intent in mind that are using their initiative to get to where they have to go. And that serves you, that type of thinking and leadership style serves you very well in this gray zone environment where it's pre-conflict, the enemy is disguising what they're doing, you're not sure where information's coming from, you're limited in what you're able to do. It's exactly the same, in fact, as it is in a physical battle.
Mm-hmm. Please, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Ashley. I'm actually a hate crime and terrorism analyst. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is radicalization online. And with the increasing propaganda, do you think that people can be radicalized online as opposed to before where there had to be a physical group for them? Or do you think that now it's possible for someone to be radicalized completely online just because they have all of these sort of, you know, supports from propaganda machines?
It's 100% possible to be radicalized online. And the group Daesh was able to radicalize tens of thousands of people, primarily online, to the point where they were able to convince them to leave places like France, Germany, Canada, leave their families and go and fight in Iraq for their cause. That is, I mean, it doesn't get any more convincing and compelling than that. And I think the response has been slow in coming, but I think we're starting to figure it out. And we're increasingly, there's these grassroots movements where we're trying to convince other young people from the same culture, religion, and background as the folks that are being radicalized, and using their peers to call them out and to say, you know what, that isn't really cool. That doesn't fit in with my view of our religion, for example. And that's starting to have an effect. But I think as long as there are disaffected people in this world, people that are marginalized, people that feel on the outside, the potential for radicalization will exist. So again, as a society, we have to figure out, you know, how do we become more inclusive? How do we engage more people into our productive society, get them to buy in to what we're offering rather than what the extremists are offering?
Thank you for your question. We've got a question over here.
You can go first. That's all right.
What's that?
You can go first.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Liam.
Hi.
I'm a student at the University of Waterloo, and I had a question about if you had any recommendations for any social media companies and what they can do to kind of increase transparency with this matter, as we're seeing with like Twitter and Facebook currently, within the United States governments and the UK and Canada calling like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, to Parliament. How could companies kind of increase the transparency and work in conjunction with the military?
Great question. So if you want to put something on TV or in a newspaper, you know, there's a rigorous set of standards. You know, that we have broadcast standards councils. But there's very little in the way of, so I actually don't think we should leave it up to the companies, because companies will act in their own interests. And the reason that some of these companies are finally taking action is because they're facing intense pressure to do so. But if it's going to disrupt their business model and cause them to make less money, they're probably going to cheap out on how far they go. And we can't always count on companies to have the best interests of society in mind. So I think, again, being a non-interventionalist, that we actually need a bit of regulation here in this space. I don't think we should go crazy because, I mean, the internet was founded on a free exchange of ideas, and we don't want to get in the way of that. But at the same time, we shouldn't tolerate abuses to the point where, you know, societies are being undermined, people are being radicalized to go and try to commit terrible acts of violence. These things are intolerable to society, and our government has a role to play to regulate that and make sure it doesn't happen.
Thank you.
No, and that's a good question, and maybe I'll add one related point. Is everyone who here is familiar with the role that Facebook played in the 2016 presidential election? Okay, here's the interesting part. Facebook wasn't hacked. It functioned as it was designed. It worked. That's what Facebook was designed to do. It sold targeted ads based on data analytics that knew you better than you know you. And so the platform wasn't broken. And so that brings up the point that I think that you were driving at, was that the corporate structure is designed to deliver value to shareholders. That's what it did. And so what we're looking at here is a problem where this is primarily the role of government or governance. You know, it could be industry-led, it could be government-led, but the reality is the status quo is not sustainable, because if the platform functions that way and it can have that impact, then probably something's got to give. We have a question over here.
Hello, my name is Simon. I'm a student here in this building and also a reservist in the CAF, so it's kind of nice to see
All
you
right.
guy, in uniform once in a while. So during the 2016 election, the Russians sought to divide Americans through disinformation, but they were really just exploiting divisions that were already really deep. Like, the Russians didn't create deep fears and resentments of different races and religions. With the 2019 federal election on the horizon, what kind of action can the government take to kind of heal or work through these divides, make sure that it's not as effective as it could be?
Good questions, and you're absolutely right. Russia didn't create the problems, but they did exploit them, and they did so with a will to cause damage, and that's concerning. So I think you're right. Canada has to pay attention. We've got an election coming up. I think the most important thing that we can do as a society is engage our citizens in awareness and debate on the issues. Sensitize people to that this kind of thing is going on. Communicate better practices in terms of being discerning consumers of information. I think we should set some limits on what political parties are allowed to do during elections and at all times during using this technology, because and I'm speaking globally here, there's a lot of the same kind of tactics that adversaries are using are being used by political parties as well. And that just, it kind of normalizes it, and it adds to the confusion. And if, you know, how can we call out our adversaries if our political leaders are doing the same thing to win an election? So I think we need to set some standards there as well. And I think if we did those two things, I think we'd be fairly well positioned.
Thank you.
What do you do in the reserves?
I'm a naval intelligence operator.
Right on. Thank you for your service. So that kind of leads me to another question. And this is, we're looking at kind of traditional asymmetric type of engagement here. And when I think about Canada, what makes us the best also makes us exposed. The nature of our democracy, our openness, and our pluralism. So you talked about rules, you talked about policy, and you talked about ethics, and those constrain what you can do, and for good reason, but our adversaries don't face the same constraints. So in your view, how disadvantaged are we in this theater as a consequence of what makes us great?
Well, I mean, we certainly face disadvantages, particularly in the short term. I think when we get fake news, fake video accusations, we start to see what we saw in Crimea, where this hybrid warfare was being conducted and we were trying to figure out what was going on. And it's a bit paralyzing in the short term. But I think in the long term, we actually have the advantage because the truth is going to come out at some point, especially if we pay attention and make sure that it comes out. So that's going to be helpful. But I think we have other advantages that our adversaries might not have. One of the things that's happening is grassroots movements around the world. So there's one group called Bellingcat. It's sort of crowdsourced journalism where journalists in their spare time or journalism students or people who are interested all work together to use technology to try to uncover atrocities, uncover propaganda, expose it. And it does some really good things, and they're kind of focused on Iraq and Syria, but they've uncovered some of the lies from the Assad regime and from the Kremlin as they operate in the same region. Stop Fake is another one that's dedicated to exposing fake imagery. And you've probably heard about trolls before on the internet, right? The Russians set up this internet agency and they employed all these people to create fake accounts and attack people that didn't share the Kremlin view. Well, in the Baltics, they had a grassroots movement called the Elves, which was just Baltic citizens that wanted to expose these fake accounts and the disinformation they were seeing coming across the border from the Kremlin. And it was spontaneous. And that power of our society to band together in defense of our values, I think that's one of our greatest strengths. Haven't seen a grassroots movement come up yet like that in Canada, but nor have we really faced the same challenges that some of these other places are. And I have no doubt that if and when this happens, that our folks are going to respond.
Well, I'm convinced. We're signing people up outside after this lecture, so get ready to do some coding. Maybe, okay, are there any final questions? I'll ask you maybe the last question of the evening then. I agree with your thesis and your sentiment, and I agree that public education and raising the level of discourse is the way to do that. And I mean, it's an occupational hazard. I work at a think tank, so we should be engaging in public debate. But people are so damn short on time. And there is so much information. It is like a fire hose. And so what do we do in the real world where people are bombarded all the time and exhausted by information? I agree with you, but I just don't know how we can do it.
The same way you're going to get across anything in that information environment. If this is important enough, and I believe it is, then we need a sustained campaign where over and over again, we find different creative ways to bring up the topic and to make the point using all kinds of technology and social media and imagery. And we just keep engaging people and eventually the message gets through. If any of you watch the Stanley Cup or the Super Bowl is probably the best example, and you see that same car commercial 14 times during the game, there's a reason why advertisers do that. We've got to do the same thing. It's the only way to cut through the noise. That's
great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this kind of brings us to the end of the lecture and the end of the discussion tonight. But let me just say this. This has been incredibly fascinating. And I listened with interest to everything that you said. And I'm not going to lie. I'm a little bit concerned about the future of our democratic institutions. I'm a little bit concerned about the asymmetry and the exposure that's created by virtue of being in a democratic society. And I'm a little bit concerned by the sophistication and persistence of our adversaries. But let me just say this as well. I'm comforted by the fact that there's people in uniform like you doing the job that you're doing. Thank you for everything you've done for us tonight. Thank you for everything that you've done for the country. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you. Thanks very much, folks, and thank you so much for taking time out from your very busy lives to listen to me drone on. And by being here, you're part of the solution, and I hope that you'll talk to your friends and family about this. And yeah, together we can keep Canada strong. So thanks very much.